Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. يقول سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا صدق الله العظيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي رب يسر ولا تعسر وتمم بالخير رب زدني علما اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So, I don't know how clear the communication was for this program again. I'm sorry it was supposed to be after Asr. I had to move it to after Maghrib today for other reasons. So we started this class last week, and I was the one doing this class last week as well. Basically, Shaykh Usman, he is not available to run this class until after reading week, right? So last class and this class, I'll be doing it inshallah. He's leaving for Umrah today inshallah. So make dua for him inshallah that he has a safe trip. But I'll be running the class. Last week I ran it and I'll be running it this week. And then inshallah from next class, Shaykh Usman will take it over. So from that, some disclaimers that I mentioned last time as well. Shaykh Usman will normally be doing this. I'm not like qualified enough to be sitting in this chair giving you like things from my own brain, right? So I'm just going to be regurgitating information that I've learned from like an academic source from teachers. So if you guys have like any questions or any deeper inquiries about what I'm saying, I don't know if I can necessarily answer them. So I might just tell you, ask Shaykh Usman. Okay? But anyways, I'll start inshallah. So how many of you guys were at the thing last week? At the class last week? Okay, anyway, I'll quickly recap what we covered last week, and inshallah this class won't be too long, but I'll try to keep it as condensed as I can. So last week, and I'll make this a little bit interactive, but we started by talking about what are the two main things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent us down on this earth to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He sent us down on this earth with two main purposes. What were they? I probably can't ask questions because like two of you are here. But anyways, He sent us down with two main purposes. Actions of survival and actions commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So actions of survival, you have like eating, you need to sleep when you get sleepy, all of those things, those are actions of survival. And then you have actions commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like siyam in Ramadan, fasting in Ramadan, right? Reading Quran, praying our salah, right? Salatul khams. These are all actions commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then for these two actions that you have in life, actions of survival and actions commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are sources of learning for these, where we learn how to go about these things. It's basically three sources that we learn about everything that we learn about. And these three things are first, our five senses, hawasun khamisatun, our five senses, right? So we take things in from this universe. Second thing is called in Arabic aql, our intellectual power. So like our ability, I said this last time, but our ability to process that when I touch a cup of coffee and it's like really hot, right? I know not to touch it again because it's like really hot. So that's the second thing, aql, intellectual power, right? These two things relate very much to this dunya, to this universe. And the thing is about these two things, they work like really well within this universe. Thinking about things within this universe, deriving conclusions within this universe, they work really well. But if you go outside of this universe, right? If you try drawing conclusions about things outside of the scope of this universe, like Jannah, Jahannam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, angels, jinn, right? All of these things, if you try deriving conclusions just based on these two things, about things outside of this universe, you'll come to like really wrong answers. And then like a perfect example of that I gave last time is atheism, right? What is atheism? It's literally trying to resolve what is outside of this universe just based on these two things. And they do that, they use their intellectual power and what they can observe around them. They use these two things and they come to the conclusion that there's no God and there's nothing outside of this universe. So if you don't use this third source of knowledge, then you'll get very lost in your thinking process. And the third source of knowledge, it's called wahy, revelation. This is objective, true knowledge, a communication from the Creator to the creation, right? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to us. This is not just the Quran, but it's anything that's been revealed to us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wahi, revelation, right? It's the Quran, it's anything and everything that the Prophet ﷺ said. All of this stuff is wahi, objective, true knowledge, right? And these three things, when you use this, primarily this third thing, to define how you go about this life, then you'll come to the right conclusions, inshallah. So, two main things you do in life: actions of survival, actions commanded by Allah, and these are the three main sources of learning. Are we all clear so far? I'm just recapping what we did last week really quickly. So then within this wahi, we talked about how Quran was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and how I'll quickly go over it, but it went from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He wrote everything. The first thing He created was the pen, al-qalam, right? And then al-qalam, He wrote everything about everything. Everything that happened in the past, everything that will happen, right? Everything that will happen after the Day of Judgment. He wrote it all down in what? In Lawh al-Mahfuz, right? Fi Lawh al-Mahfuz. It's in Surah al-Buruj. بَلْ هُوَ قُرْآنٌ مَجِيدٌ فِي لَوْحٍ مَحْفُوظٍ. That this Quran was written in this Lawh al-Mahfuz, in this preserved tablet is what it's called. And then this Quran was revealed from this preserved tablet, first to the Bayt al-Ma'mur, right? The house of the angels above the Kaaba, and then onto this world throughout the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's how this Quran got from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to this preserved tablet, to the first revelation, to the second revelation, which is onto this world, to the Prophet ﷺ. So that's pretty much what we covered last week. Just a general overview of where the Quran fits into the picture and how it came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the way down to the Prophet ﷺ. So, the two topics that we're going to cover today, inshallah, they're super cool topics that I think will answer a lot of questions that a lot of you guys might have. The first topic is the 7 ahruf of the Quran. What that basically means is that you know how there's different recitations of the Quran, right? For example, some people say Maliki Yawmiddin, and then other people say Maliki Yawmiddin, right? Some people say Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, other people say Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhum, right? Where did these come from? If there was one Quran in the beginning, where did these come from? How do they fit into the picture, right? That's the first thing that we're going to cover. It'll be like a short thing on the 7 ahruf of the Quran. And then the second thing is coming back to this whole line from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Quran down to us. Now, from the Prophet ﷺ, he has the Quran now. How did this Quran come all the way down to this day and age? Our people, right? How do we have a copy of this Quran that we can read, and it's the exact same copy that everyone else has? So these are the two things that we'll be covering today, inshallah. So I'll start with the first one, the 7 letters of the Quran. So this is actually one of the biggest points of confusion within Islam, right? Because people come to us, and the one main thing about Islam is that we have this sacred text that's the same that our Prophet had, that we have now, right? But then people come to us and they're like, well, there's different versions of this Quran, right? Not everyone is reading it in the same way. How can it be like a preserved, same text, if one person is reading it in one way, and then another person is reading it in the other way? Where did this come from? Right? It's clearly not the same Quran. There's versions of it, right? There's actually a very, subhanAllah, beautiful reasoning and explanation for this. So basically, I'll try to explain this as best as I can. But it starts from this hadith about the Prophet ﷺ. He was sitting by a pond called the Pond al-Ghifat back in his time, right? And Jibreel ﷺ came to him and he commanded him, Ya Rasulullah, you have to tell people, everyone around you, to recite the Quran in one way, in one ahruf, in one letter. We're just going to use the word letter. Letter doesn't mean actual letter here, but we're just going to say letter. So tell everyone to recite the Quran in one way, right? But the Arabs, there are many types of Arabs, right? So it's not easy for everyone to recite in one way, in one kind of dialect, right? Arabs have very different ways of talking. Like you see in today's day and age, Egyptian Arabic is completely different from Algerian Arabic. It's completely different from the Quranic Fusha Arabic, right? They're completely different things. So in that same kind of way, Jibreel ﷺ came and said, Ya Rasulullah, Allah has commanded you to tell everyone to recite the Quran in one way. But the Prophet ﷺ said, I know my people, they can't do this because they can't all speak this same way. So the Prophet ﷺ, there was this back and forth, and the Prophet ﷺ eventually came at that there will be 7 ahruf of the Quran. What are these ahruf? I'll explain in a second. But there's 7 ahruf of the Quran. They're basically 7 like variations. That's where these 10 main recitations we see today come from. Okay, stay with me for a second. I know it's like a little bit confusing. Basically, you know how there's 10 recitations of the Quran, right? 10 verified recitations in today's day and age. What's the main one that we recited normally? What is it called? Hafs, right? Hafs is the main recitation that I think everyone in this room probably knows, right? Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka Na'budu. This whole Quran, all the masahib that we have in this musallah, probably like most of the world, right, is all in Hafs. The next common one is called what? Welsh, right? Now this is the one where they say Maliki Yawmiddin, and they have like a couple of different changes, not changes, but there's a couple of different variations within this recitation. So there's like 10 recitations like this. Okay? Now where do these 10 recitations come from? That's where these 7 letters come into play. Basically, these 7 letters are like changes in specific things that I'll go through one by one that create these 10 different recitations. Like there's choices of different variations of these 7 letters that result in these 10 recitations. Okay? Now what are these 7 letters? These 7 letters are basically this. I'll go through them one by one. The first letter or variation, think of a letter as a variation in the Quran, is related to nouns. So in one variation, a noun might be in its singular form, and in another variation, a noun might be in its plural form. So you have like وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَةُ رَبِّكَ صَدْقًا وَعَدْلًا, right? But in another variation, it's وَتَمَّتْ كَلِمَاتُ رَبِّكَ صَدْقًا وَعَدْلًا. It changed from kalima, like one, to like kalimat, plural. Right? So that's the first ahruf of the Quran. And now in these 10 different recitations that we have, some recitations have one, some recitations have the other. You see what I'm saying here? Now we have the second ahruf of the Quran, the second letter of the Quran, which is a variation according to verbs. So in one variation, a verb might be on one pattern, and in another variation, it's on another pattern. Basically in Arabic, this is a deeper topic, but like it's beautiful the way the Arabic language works. You know how we read Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, right? In the words Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, what are the 3 root letters? Raha and Mim, right? It's the same, Rahman and Rahim. They both come from Raha and Mim. But this like Raha and Mim, you plug it into a certain pattern. For Rahman, you plug it into the pattern of Fa'alan, and you get Rahman. And then for Rahim, you plug it into the pattern of Fa'il, and you get Rahim. And these 2 words, even though they come from Raha and Mim, they come up with like 2 different meanings because you plugged it into these 2 patterns. So you get the most compassionate and the most merciful. Just from these same 3 root letters, right? You plug it into different patterns and you get different meanings at the end of the day. But these meanings, they all like contribute to each other. They don't contradict each other, but they like build on each other basically. Right? So that's the point of all of these ahruf. None of them contradict each other, they all build on top of each other. So this is the second variation related to verbs. So for example, in one place in the Quran, you'll see رَبَّنَا بَاعِدْ بَيْنَ أَسْفَارِنَا. But then in another variation, you'll see رَبَّنَا بَاعِدْ بَيْنَ أَسْفَارِنَا with the tashdid. Right? So this is another variation, and then some recitations of the 10 have it in one way, some recitations have it in the other way. So you guys see where I'm going with this, right? That these 7 ahruf, these 7 variations of the Quran. The third variation is related to i'rab, which is basically like a state. It's a bit complicated, but you can think of it as like fatha kasra damma. Very loosely, you can think of it as fatha kasra damma, right? So you have in one variation, dhul arsh al majidi fa'alun lima yurid, right? But in another variation, you have dhul arsh al majidu. So that's the third ahruf of the Quran. So we have difference in the plurality and singularity of nouns, the difference in pattern of verbs, and then this third one, the difference in the state, or the fatha kasra damma, right? Fourth variation is the absence and presence of certain words. So for example, you can have tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, right? But in another variation, you have tajri tahtiha al-anhar, just amidst the word min, right? So it's just not in there. That's another variation. You have another variation, the fifth one, which is the ordering of words. So you have وَجَاءَتْ سَكْرَةُ الْمَوْتِ بِالْحَقِّ. But in another variation, you have وَجَاءَتْ سَكْرَةُ الْحَقِّ بِالْمَوْتِ. So that's the sixth variation, I think. And then, Sorry, that's the fifth variation. The sixth one is completely different words that have the same meaning. So in one variation you have nushiraha, and then in another variation you have nashuraha. So these are two completely different words that mean the same thing almost, right? But they're two completely different words. So that's the sixth variation. And the last variation is basically to accommodate for people with different dialects. Like in the Quran when it says, Ya Musa la takhaf, right? There's actually a certain riwayat or certain recitation in the Quran, right? Where they read it as Ya Musa la takhaf, like with the A sound. You know in Urdu we have like A, that A sound that you don't have in Arabic, right? In one variation, it sounds like Musa to accommodate for those people who are more familiar with saying it like that. Bottom line, you don't have to know all these seven, but these are the seven ahruf of the Quran. And through having some of these in like some way and some of these in another way, we come with these 10, all completely valid recitations of the Quran, which all, they don't mean the exact same thing, but none of their meaning contradicts each other. It all builds on each other. You know, they all support each other. So that's where these 10 different recitations of the Quran come into. It was there from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. It's not something that was created, right? And it was there to accommodate for everyone, so that they can all read the Quran. Does that make sense with everyone? I just wanted to explain that concept to everyone, because I think it's something really important that we all understand. Okay, I'll move to the second topic now, which is the preservation of the Quran. And this is like a super interesting one, seeing how the Quran actually came from the Prophet ﷺ, down Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, all the way down to us. How do we have this Quran in our hands, right? And when you look at the intricacy of how it was actually preserved and the effort that went into like making sure every single thing was accurate and what it was before, it's like beautiful, subhanAllah. So I'll start from here. You know we have the order in the Quran, right? The order where we start from Al-Fatiha, then Al-Baqarah, then Ali Imran. That order, right? Up until Surah An-Nas, right? This was all done at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so we'll start from here. Basically, this order was done at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and my notes are very messy here. But what would happen is Jibreel ﷺ would come to the Prophet ﷺ with the Quran, right? He would come with a Quranic revelation. He would come to the Prophet ﷺ saying, there's this ayah now, it comes in this surah, in this part, and this is the ayah. Okay? Now what would happen? First thing that would happen, the Prophet ﷺ would recite it and he would memorize it. Right? The next thing that would happen is he would teach it to the huffaz, to the people who knew the Quran, who had the Quran memorized, right? And this is the primary way of preserving the Quran. It's oral tradition. That's the beauty of our religion, that the primary way of preserving the Quran is the oral tradition. But what the Prophet ﷺ would also do is when a verse like this was revealed, the Prophet ﷺ, he would call one of his scribes to him. One of his scribes who would write these ayat down. He would call them to him and he would say, this ayat was just revealed, write it down. And this wasn't on because they didn't have paper and pens back in that time, right? So it was on anything like a leaf or like a wooden stick, anything that you can write on. He had 60 plus scribes, right? And anytime something would come down, he would get one of these scribes and he would ask them, write this down. Write this ayah that just came down, write it down, right? So you can imagine now, each of these scribes have like a compilation of a bunch of ayat, right? But none of them are in order or anything, because the Quran was not revealed like in the order that we know it, right? It was revealed whenever it was relevant to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it was placed into those surahs. So this Quran, these scribes wrote it down basically, right? And they each had these compilations of the Quran. But then the death of the Prophet ﷺ came, and the Quran was in this form. It was in the memorization of a lot of huffaz, and it was in like each of these scribes, they had like a big compilation of a bunch of mixed up ayat. Right? So now we wonder why the Prophet ﷺ didn't compile the whole thing into one book in the time of his life. Right? Because that would make like the process of preservation a lot simpler, right? You think about it for 1 second though. The Prophet ﷺ, he didn't know when the revelation was going to end. He didn't know when a certain part was going to come into a certain surah. Right? How would he be able to come up with a book? even through his scribes, right? How would he be able to come up with a book? Because he would never know when a certain ayat would be inserted or when a certain ayat would be put somewhere. He would never know that, right? We only know the Quran is done being revealed after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So that's why there was no written copy like this at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So we have all of these scribes basically who have a bunch of different ayat, all written on these different parchments, these leaves, these wooden pieces, right? So this is where we are now, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And then we also have all of these huffaz who have the Quran memorized, right? So this is where it stays like this for a while, but then there's a battle that occurs. What's the name of that battle? Yarmouk? I think it's Yamama. Battle of Yamama. What happens in this battle is a lot of the huffaz that exist in the Muslim community, a lot of them get killed. Right? A lot of them die. And that's like, because primary mode of preservation is what? Oral tradition. Right? All these huffaz who know the Quran, a lot of them are dying. Right? So Umar, radiallahu anhu, he comes to Abu Bakr and he says, "Yeah, Abu Bakr, I'm getting concerned because all these huffaz around us are dying, right? We need a way to preserve this Quran." And then this idea of like coming up with a written copy of the Quran is brought up. So then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he's reluctant at first because but then eventually he gives in and he says, "Yes, this is a good idea." Right? So the process of how this was done, basically, sorry, I'm just like lost with my notes right now. Yeah, I'm trying to like find where I was in my notes because I'm just rambling. Okay, so Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he agreed, let's make a copy of this Quran. Let's make a written copy of this Quran. Right? The name of this copy is called Al-Um. What does Al-Um mean in Arabic? The mother, right? It's called the mother. It's like the first written copy of the Quran. And how this was compiled, basically how they would do it is this message that they're going to start a written copy of the Quran was sent to everyone. It was sent to everyone, right? That we're going to compile a written copy of the Quran. So any ayat that you have written from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Not a copy of it, but the original one that you were at with the Prophet ﷺ at that time, and he asked you to write it down, right? Only those ones. And not only that, come with two witnesses who know this is the original ayah. Right? So anyone who has these parchments, bring them to the government basically, right? And show them this ayah, and they'll write it down and they'll keep it in a folder. And that's how ayah by ayah, word by word, from each one of these scribes, right? This whole Quran was compiled into like...
Two witnesses had to also be from like, they had to have memorized it from the Prophet being part.
And there's a bunch of other stuff that I'm like grazing over. But Zayd ibn Thabit, who was the main scribe, he was also there. All of these huffaz would also verify that this is the same ayah, right? All of these layers of protection to make sure it's the same Quran. Right? Think about that. Just the same parchment, not even a copy of it, which is probably the same, right? The same parchment that the Prophet ﷺ told you to write. Then you bring two witnesses. Then they check this with the huffaz who've actually memorized the Quran. Then they take this and they put this into like a folder of each surah. And this is how the Quran was basically compiled, right? Now you come to this point of, okay, well there's different ahruf of the Quran, right? If we have in the Quran, وَجَاءَتْ سَكْرَةُ الْمَوْتِ بِالْحَقِّ and وَجَاءَتْ سَكْرَةُ الْحَقِّ بِالْمَوْتِ, right? How do you accommodate for both of those things? Because those are two different ayat, right? How do you keep both of those things in this like compilation now? Basically what they would do is they would write both of them, one after the other. So in this in this Quran, all of the different recitations were there. Each of the 7 variations, everything was in this in this Quran. Right? So this master copy of the Quran, just this one master copy, kept by the government now. Okay, are you guys all following so far? There's this one master copy kept by the government. It's called and it's like the original copy of the Quran. If anyone needs to check anything, that's where they check it. Right? Now, of course, Islam is spreading. Right? Islam is spreading to different empires. Right? And this it's not as accessible to everyone, right? And for a bunch of other reasons. So now we come to the time of Usman radiallahu anhu. Right? And this is where the first kind of modern copy of the Quran comes into play that we have in today's day. Right? And have you guys heard the term Uthmani script before? Like the Uthmani script in the Quran, right? That's where this came from. This unique script of Arabic that accommodates for all of these 7 ahruf, that accommodates for all of these different variations of the Quran. You know how in the original Quran, you guys have probably heard that there was no dots in that Quran, right? What's the reason for that? Firstly, because they could already like read it because they were like real Arabs, right? But the reason for that is to accommodate for these different ahruf of the Quran. So if you had a ta somewhere and a tha somewhere, right? Both of these versions would be accommodated for by that Uthmani script. So this Uthmani script, there's difference of opinion, but like 5 or 7 or 9 copies of this script were made, and they were each of one of them, they were sent to each one of the empires that Islam was being preached in, right? With 2 people to teach that copy of the Quran. And now this almost same Uthmani script with some accommodations to like help us read it, because if you gave us a Quran without any dots, right, we wouldn't be able to read it, right? So with some minor accommodations just to help us to read it, that's the same Quran that we have in today's day. The Uthmani Quran, the Arabic Quran that you open up today, that's the same Uthmani script Quran with just some accommodations that we have in today's day. So that's how, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, with the oral tradition, with the written tradition, first book that's made in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, right, with the help of Zayd ibn Thabit, the primary scribe. Then from this in the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, all of these copies of the Quran were made and they were sent to the different empires with 2 people to teach them. And then from that same Uthmani script, we have the Quran that we have today. Does that make sense to everyone? That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Quran, Baytul Ma'mur, to the Prophet ﷺ, through the life of the Prophet, it's revealed. Then Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and then all the way down to the same Quran that we have today. That's the whole process of this revelation. And that's why it's so beautiful that this Quran, the intricate detail that was put into keeping it word for word, letter for letter, right? It's beautiful, subhanAllah. So that's like one of the most beautiful things about this religion of Islam, that this sacred text that we have is in fact the exact same text that was revealed to our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Other than that, I did not have much else to cover today, but I had one more thing for us to do, inshallah. I think that's like 30 minutes as well. Okay, last thing. So from next time, inshallah, it'll be Shaykh Usman taking these over. Okay, so you guys have had enough of me, alhamdulillah. But you'll be basically actually starting these tafsir of the surahs, right? So actually going into these surahs and talking about what they mean, the tafsir of them, the beauty of them, right? And then you can actually, like, in your salah, you can think about what they mean now. For those of you who don't understand Arabic, including myself, right? So we're coming up with a list of like surahs that would be interesting or like beneficial to cover in these tafsir sessions with Shaykh Usman, right? So alhamdulillah, you guys now that you're all here, you get the benefit of helping us choose which surahs are we going to actually cover in these. Okay? So here's how this is going to work. We have like a list that we compiled with the education team of like 10 surahs right now. Okay? I'll list them all out first. And then what I'll do is I'll go again. I'll like list them out. But I want each one of you to raise hands for which surahs you're interested in hearing the tafsir for. Not that you don't want to hear them for all of them, but in the limited number of classes that we have, right? Which ones are you most interested in? Okay? And you can vote for a maximum of 5 surahs. Okay, and then based on those numbers, we'll give it to Shaykh Usman, and then from his discretion, we'll choose which surahs we actually cover in these sessions. Okay, is that clear to everyone? Okay, so these are the surahs that we have planned so far. First on the list is Surah Nasr, right? So إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ, right? These are tiny surahs, but the tafsir for them are like long. Right? There's a lot of detail that goes into them. We actually learn this intricate detail of that tafsir. It's beautiful, subhanAllah. So this is the first surah that we have, Surah Nasr. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ. Okay? Second surah, Surah Al-Asr. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. Right? Third surah, Surah Al-Duha. وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى. Right? We're voting afterwards. I'm just listing all the surahs so you know what they are before we vote. Right? Number 4, Surah Al-Takathur. Al-Hakum Al-Takathur. Right? Number 5, Surah Al-Ma'un. Number 6, Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas. Those are kind of a pair. Number 7, Surah Al-Ikhlas. Number 8, specifically Ayatul Kursi. So Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. Right? Number 9, the last few ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah, because alhamdulillah a lot of us know that, and they're really beautiful ayat. So from La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha. Right? And then number 10, Surah Al-Mulk. I don't know if it'll be like the whole Surah Al-Mulk or how much in depth, but these are the 10 surahs, okay? Now I'm going to go through them again one by one, but you guys each raise your hand if you're interested. Out of these 5, which 5 are you most interested in, inshallah? Okay? So, start from the top, Surah Al-Nasr. You guys don't have to vote out of pity. If there's surahs that you're actually interested in, not out of pity, that sounds wrong.
Wait, are there only going to be like a maximum of 5, or?
There's going to be around 5 to 6, right?
Okay.
So just so that not everyone votes for everything, because everyone will vote for everything, right?
Okay.
So that we can actually see numbers. So who votes for surah? Only select 5 surahs. 5 surahs. So start from Surah Al-Nasr. Who votes for Surah Al-Nasr? You just had your hand up there. Okay. Yeah, after. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. What's your question, Mehdi? We'll go at the end and see if there's any surahs that we want. The Surah Fatiha is good. I don't know why it's not on here. Okay, I don't know why it's not on here. Okay. Surah Al-Asr. Okay. Surah Al-Fatiha. That's like every. Surah Al-Duha. Surah Al-Takathur. You can only vote 5 times, you know that, right? No, 5 times. You can vote 5 times. This guy's just raising his hand every time. Surah Al-Takathur.
Is this the 5th surah?
5th surah. Yeah. Surah Al-Takathur. Okay. Surah Al-Ma'un. Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Al-Nas. Okay. Surah Al-Ikhlas. Qul huwallahu ahad. Okay. Ayatul Kursi. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. Okay. Last few ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah. La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha.
Sorry, what? Which one?
Last few ayat of Surah Al-Baqarah. So la yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha. And last, Surah Al-Mulk. Okay. Jazakallah khairan, guys. So I'll bring this to Shaykh Usman with like a ranking of like which surahs you guys are most interested in. We'll try to cover as many as we can. It's up to Shaykh Usman. But this is just so we can get a sense of like, not that everything's not should be covered inshallah, but like what people want most covered. Jazakumullah khairan. We'll just conclude with the closing dua. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Jazakumullah khairan for coming, guys. Have a good rest of your day.